The setup wasn't even finished when Calvin Ricks slapped a $50 bill on the folding table and laughed loud enough for Cedar Row to hear. "I'll bet Darius can't get the Ice Queen next door to show her face at the party." People laughed. Because for 3 weeks, Evelyn Hart had turned down every knock, every wave, every plate of welcome food left on her porch. The actual block party was still 2 weeks away. This was just a setup afternoon, moving tables, checking equipment, but it had already become more interesting than anyone planned. Nobody noticed Evelyn was standing on the other side of the fence. Not until she walked through the gate, lifted the bill off the table, and pressed it into Darius's shirt pocket. Then she looked at him, not Calvin, not the crowd, and said, "You could have just knocked on my door, but that would have required treating me like a neighbor." So would Darius take the bet, or do what nobody saw coming? If you believe that how you treat someone when there's nothing in it for you says everything about who you are, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let's get into it. Darius Bennett had lived on Cedar Row for 6 years, and in that time he had learned one thing about the neighborhood. It noticed everything, and remembered most of it wrong. People knew he was a woodworker. They called it that furniture thing he does, which was fine. He had a small shop behind the house, good tools, steady hands, and enough regular clients to keep the lights on without needing to explain himself to anyone. What the neighbors didn't say out loud, but what everyone seemed to understand, was that Darius was the kind of man you called when something needed fixing, and you didn't want to make a whole production out of it. The broken fence post at Ruth Malone's place, done before she got back from church. Marcus Webb's truck dying 2 blocks from home on a Tuesday night, Darius was already pulling up before Marcus finished dialing. He didn't do those things to be liked. He did them because not doing them never sat right with him. After his marriage ended 3 years ago, Darius had gotten quieter. Not bitter, just more deliberate. He had a daughter, Lily, who split her time between 2 households, and that arrangement had clarified something important. The stability he provided her depended entirely on the stability he maintained for himself. So he stopped chasing noise. He went to work, came home occasionally, sat on the porch with a cold drink, and watched the streets settle into evening. It wasn't a small life. It was a clean one, and he'd worked hard enough to earn it that he didn't take it lightly. Then Evelyn Hart moved in at the end of the block, and Cedar Row collectively lost its mind. She arrived on a Thursday with a moving truck and 0 conversation. No introduction, no wave. When Ruth brought over a welcome plate of lemon bars, Ruth brought everyone lemon bars. It was practically a Cedar Row ordinance. Evelyn accepted them at the door, said, "Thank you," and closed it. Not rudely, just completely. Like the transaction was finished the moment the plate changed hands. Within a week, the neighborhood had a name for her: the Ice Queen. Someone said it first in the group chat, and after that it stuck the way nicknames do when people are too entertained to question them. There was something satisfying about the label. It made her refusals feel like a personality flaw rather than a choice, which was easier to discuss. Darius didn't use it. He had noticed things nobody else seemed to bother noticing. The cracked bottom step on Ruth's porch had been repaired sometime in the 2nd week. Smooth, clean patch job, the kind that took more than 5 minutes with no note left behind. The morning old Marcus couldn't walk to the pharmacy because his knee was flaring up. A paper bag with the right medication appeared outside his door before 9 a.m. And every time a storm was coming, the trash cans along the block were pulled in from the curb. All of them. Without fail. Without anyone asking. Evelyn Hart wasn't cold. She just didn't need an audience. Darius had filed that away and left it there. He wasn't looking for a project. He wasn't looking for much of anything. The block party was Calvin's idea, same as every year. Calvin Ricks had a genuine talent for organizing things, and an equal talent for not thinking them fully through. He was the kind of man who arrived at every social situation 15 minutes late with twice the energy needed, made everyone laugh, and somehow disappeared before the cleanup. Darius had known him since high school. He genuinely liked Calvin. He also knew exactly what Calvin was, and more importantly, what Calvin couldn't see in himself. This year, the party had a purpose beyond food and lawn chairs. Cedar Row Community Center, the squat brick building on the corner that had been hosting senior bingo nights and youth tutoring sessions for 40 years, was facing a rezoning push from a development group nobody on the block had heard of 6 months ago. A city meeting was coming. They needed signatures, community presence, And ideally, someone who understood what the legal documents actually meant before they signed anything. Calvin had heard Evelyn was a lawyer. Urban law, specifically. He'd mentioned it twice in conversation, and then apparently decided the most effective recruitment strategy was a $50 bet in front of an audience, rather than simply walking to the end of the block and knocking on a door like a grown man. The actual party was 2 weeks out. That afternoon was a setup day. Tables, sound equipment, the usual pre-event argument about whether to run the extension cords along the fence or cut across the grass. But it had become considerably more interesting than anyone planned. Darius was standing 3 feet away when Calvin put the bill on the table. He watched it happen the way you watch a pot beginning to boil, aware of exactly what's coming, not quite able to stop it before it does. I'll bet Darius can't get the Ice Queen next door to show her face at the party. The laughter was easy. It always was when the joke was about someone who wasn't there. Except she was. Darius caught Evelyn's shadow through the fence boards a half-second before Calvin spoke. He opened his mouth to redirect to say anything that would land before the words did, and then it was already too late, and Evelyn was walking through the gate. She moved like someone who had rehearsed that walk 1,000 times in their head. No hesitation, no announcement. She lifted the bill off the table without breaking stride, crossed to Darius, not Calvin, not the crowd, just Darius, and pressed it into his shirt pocket. Her voice was even, controlled, but not soft. You could have just knocked on my door, but that would have required treating me like a neighbor. Then she looked at the faces around the table, let the silence hold for exactly 1 beat, and walked back toward the gate. Calvin laughed first. The nervous kind, the sound a room makes when nobody knows what else to do with themselves. A few others followed. Darius didn't. He reached into his pocket, took the 50 out, and set it back on the table. She's not a prize. Not loud, not heated, just clear the way a statement is clear when the person saying it doesn't feel the need to dress it up. She's not a game. She's not something for this block to figure out like a puzzle. The laughter stopped. Calvin blinked. Man, it was just a... I know what it was. Same tone, no drama attached to it. It wasn't funny. He left the 50 on the table and walked toward the fence. Calvin looked at the bill, reached for it with one hand, then stopped and left it there sitting unclaimed in the middle of the table where everyone could see it. Evelyn was almost to her porch steps when footsteps sounded behind her. She turned slowly, arms crossed, expression already set in the particular way that had ended most conversations before they started over the past 3 weeks. Darius stopped at the fence line, didn't step through, didn't move closer to her property, just stood there, hands in his pockets, no particular agenda written on his face. I'm not here to apologize for Calvin, he said. That's his job, not mine. She waited. If you want to come to the party, you're welcome. If you don't, that's also fine. A pause. I make cornbread from scratch. I always make more than I need. I'll leave some by your door either way, and I won't mention this afternoon again. Evelyn studied him with the kind of attention she usually reserved for contracts she didn't quite trust. Is this your way of winning the bet on a longer timeline? I don't need to win anything that involves you. A plain sentence. No weight added to it, no undertone to decode. That was almost the strangest part of the whole exchange. She held his gaze for a moment longer. There are reasons I don't do this, she said, and didn't clarify what this meant. She didn't feel she owed that clarification to anyone. Then her phone rang. She pulled it from her pocket. For just a fraction of a second, a half-breath's worth of time, the kind you'd miss if you blinked, something moved across her face. Not fear, exactly. The particular exhaustion that lives on the other side of being afraid long enough that the fear stops being an event and becomes the background to everything else. The name on the screen, Nolan Voss. She cut the call without answering. When she looked back up, her expression had already reset itself, but her hand had closed around the phone before she pocketed it, and that small, involuntary grip told Darius more than she probably intended. He didn't say anything about it. He said, "Cornbread's usually ready by 6, and started back toward the gate. He was almost through when she spoke. Do you actually make it from scratch, or is this a box situation? He turned around. Her voice had something careful in it. A door opened just a fraction of an inch, just enough to see whether the hinges were sound. Cast iron skillet, he said. Buttermilk, my grandmother's recipe. Evelyn said nothing, but she didn't go inside. Darius walked back through the gate, and for the first time since she'd moved to Cedar Row, Evelyn Hart stood in her own yard and didn't feel like she was already preparing for what would go wrong. It wasn't safety, not yet, maybe not for a while, but it was the first moment that didn't feel like the opposite of it. Across the yard, Calvin stood at the table with the $50 bill still sitting exactly where Darius had left it. He looked at it for a long moment, looked at the gate Evelyn had walked back through, looked at nothing in particular for a few seconds after that. Ruth Malone, watching from her porch chair with the patience of someone who had been watching this block long enough to know how most stories ended, caught his eye. She didn't say a word, just looked at him quiet and unhurried. Calvin was the first to look away. The cornbread was on Evelyn's porch the next morning at 6:15. No knock, no note, just a dish covered with a clean cloth, still warm enough that the ceramic had fogged slightly in the cool morning air. She found it on her way to check the mail she already knew hadn't arrived yet, a habit she'd carried from her old life, something to do with her hands before the day started asking things of her. She stood there a moment holding the dish and then went inside. The plate was back on Darius's porch by 8. Washed, dried, placed upright against the door with a flathead screw beside it, the exact size and thread count for the loose hinge on his front gate. The hinge he hadn't mentioned to anyone that he'd been meaning to get to for 2 weeks. Darius picked up the screw and turned it over in his fingers. She noticed things too. She just didn't make an announcement of it. The conversation started the way real things usually do, small and sideways. A comment about the water pressure on her side of the block. A question about the oak tree lifting the sidewalk at the corner. One afternoon she watched him sand the arm of a rocking chair from across the fence and observed without particular warmth that he was going against the grain. He told her he knew. She said most people didn't catch that. He said most people weren't looking. They didn't trade histories. They talked about the fence, the whether the city council's consistent habit of mailing official notices that explained nothing useful. Evelyn had a way of cutting to the center of any subject, fast, clean, no wasted motion. And Darius found that he didn't need to soften his words around her. She didn't want softened. She wanted accurate. Ruth Malone observed all of this from her porch with the careful attention of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by people and started simply being interested in them. One evening, she caught Darius on his way in from the shop. "You know what that woman is doing?" Ruth asked. "What's that?" "She's checking," Ruth said, "seeing whether you're still there after there's nothing left to get from you." She adjusted the shawl on her shoulders. Most people aren't. Darius didn't answer that, but he thought about it for the rest of the night longer than he expected to. What the neighborhood saw was a woman who refused to participate. What Darius noticed slowly, the way you notice something you weren't looking for, was a person who had rearranged her entire life around the expectation that being visible meant being targeted. Evelyn never left her front light on past 9. She checked her door lock more than once before leaving each morning, not nervously, but with the mechanical certainty of someone who had learned precisely what forgetting cost. One night, a raccoon knocked over a trash can 2 houses down, and Darius stepped outside to check the noise and saw her light already on her shadow passing across the window. She'd heard it too. She just handled it the same way she seemed to handle everything alone, efficiently and without mentioning it to anyone afterward. She never accepted help the first time it was offered. Without exception, she'd decline, figure it out herself, then somehow return the favor before you realized you'd given it. Like accepting anything, even the smallest thing, was a door she'd trained herself to keep closed, because open doors had a way of being used. Darius didn't press it. He stayed consistent. Nothing extra offered, nothing withheld, the same as he'd always been with everyone else on the block. No different treatment because she was new or because the circumstances were strange. On a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the table incident, Evelyn came around the fence while Darius was working on a dining chair, one of a matched set he was restoring for a client downtown. He had a work lamp balanced on the porch rail at a bad angle, and it was losing the battle with gravity. "Hold on," Evelyn said, and picked up the lamp and positioned it properly without being asked. They worked like that for a while. He focused on the joints. She held the light steady. The street was quiet around them. Someone down the block had a radio playing low. She started talking the way people sometimes do in the dark, not because they've made a decision to, but because the silence eventually gets heavy enough that words feel lighter than holding them in. I used to be a city attorney, she said. Municipal land use, zoning disputes, development contracts permitting. He didn't say I know, even though half the block had already looked her up. He listened. I found something in the documents for a rezoning deal. Money moving the wrong direction through the right people. A pause. The attorney of record on the other side was my husband. Darius set down the clamp he was holding. I reported it. Her voice stayed level. And then I didn't have a job anymore, and I didn't have most of my professional relationships anymore, and I moved here because I needed somewhere Nolan wouldn't think to look for a few months. She glanced at him. He thought to look. Is that what the calls are? He doesn't want me back, she said. He wants me to know he can still find me. There's a difference. She looked at the lamp in her hand like she'd forgotten she was holding it. He likes that I know. Darius was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that came from actually thinking before speaking. Are you okay? He asked. Not that must have been hard. Not I can't imagine. Just the direct question. Right now, this specific moment. Evelyn looked at him. Something in her expression adjusted, not softening exactly, more like a tension found a slightly less constant position, like it had been held at one angle for so long that even a small shift registered. I don't know, she said. It's been a while since anyone asked that without wanting something from the answer. Her phone buzzed against the railing. She picked it up. Nolan Voss. A text this time. I know you're with him. Don't drag other people into what's ours. She turned the phone face down on the rail. When she looked back up, her hands were steady, but her jaw was set in the way that meant she was working to keep them that way. Darius didn't reach for the phone. Didn't ask to see it. Didn't volunteer to handle anything. He picked the clamp back up and returned to the joint. You don't have to tell me anything else, he said. I know. She kept holding the lamp until the work was done. 3 days before the party, Darius received a formal notice from the neighborhood association. Compliance review. Concerns had been raised about his shop's operating hours and zoning classification. An inspection was being scheduled at the city's request. Calvin came over that evening looking like a man who had been carrying something heavier than he'd anticipated and had finally decided he couldn't carry it alone any further. The complaint, he said. It didn't come from the block. Darius waited. I know someone on the association board. He told me it was called in from a law office downtown. Calvin looked at the porch floor. The name on it was Nolan Voss. The name sat between them in the air. Calvin, I know. You knew before you came over here. Since yesterday morning. He still wasn't looking up. I didn't know how to bring it. Darius was quiet for a long moment. So what you're telling me is that you found out Evelyn's ex-husband is going after my shop because she and I have been talking. And your response was to sit on it for a day and a half. Calvin had nothing for that, which was at least honest. The news moved through Cedar Row the way bad news always does, fast and slightly worse with each retelling. By the next afternoon, a portion of the block had quietly settled on a conclusion Evelyn's presence was the problem. Not Nolan's behavior, not the mechanism he was using, not the fact that a man was deliberately targeting someone's livelihood to punish a woman for leaving him. Evelyn's presence. Someone said it to her face. Gently, with genuine concern, which in some ways made it considerably worse than if it had been said cruelly. Evelyn stood in her driveway and absorbed it with the stillness of a person who has had long practice at not reacting. But Darius was close enough to see her hands close at her sides. He walked over, didn't address the neighbor directly, stood beside Evelyn and spoke clearly enough for anyone nearby to follow. Nolan is running a play he has run before, he said. On her career, on her credibility, on anyone who didn't make things easy for him. She is not the problem. A man who uses legal filings the way other people use a fist is the problem. He looked at the neighbor then, not with anger, but with the kind of settled steadiness that didn't leave room for argument. Those are two different things. The neighbor nodded slowly and moved on. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I know. That evening, Calvin sat on his front steps for a long time. He had started everything with a $50 bill and a joke, and genuinely meant nothing by it. And he'd been turning that phrase over in his head for days now, because the more he turned it, the less it helped him. Meaning nothing by something had not stopped a single consequence from following. He was good at making rooms laugh. He'd never been as practiced at what came after, looking clearly at what the laughter had cost, and sitting with that without deflecting it into something easier. Ruth came by on her evening walk and stopped in front of his steps. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him patient and unhurried, the way she had after the table incident. Calvin couldn't hold it. "I know, Ruth." "I know you know," she said. "I'm just wondering what you're going to do about it." He didn't have a clean answer. Not yet. But he went inside, found the number for his contact on the association board and called him. Not to smooth anything over quietly. To ask, and to put the question in writing, who had authorized an inspection request to bypass the standard intake process and what grounds had been cited to justify it. It was a small thing. He didn't know if it would matter. He sent it anyway. The morning of the party, Nolan filed an emergency injunction to halt the event. Improper permitting. Unauthorized use of the community center for commercial purposes. The filing was clean, precise, and designed to generate enough procedural uncertainty that the party simply wouldn't happen. Simultaneously, Darius received confirmation that his shop inspection had been escalated to a full compliance review scheduled for the following week. If anything in his paperwork was out of order, anything at all, the fines could be significant. Evelyn read both notices at Darius's kitchen table twice each, with the particular care of someone mapping the structure of an argument before deciding how to answer it. Then she said she needed to go home. Darius followed her to the door. He could see it happening, the familiar withdrawal, the calculation she had clearly run many times before. I am the cost. Remove the cost. Problem solved. It was the same logic that had probably seemed reasonable every other time she'd used it. She was halfway across the yard when she said it without turning around. "You're a good man, Darius." Her voice was measured, deliberate. Good men shouldn't have to stand in the middle of someone else's storm. "Evelyn!" She stopped. "You're not a storm." He said it the same way he said most things, direct, without cushion around it. "You're someone a bad man has spent years trying to convince you're dangerous. Those aren't the same thing." She stood with her back to him, long enough that the street felt very quiet around both of them. Then she turned around. Her face carried the specific tiredness of someone who has been fighting something invisible long enough that they've half started to believe what they were told about themselves. "I don't know how to stay somewhere when it starts falling apart," she said. "I've always left first, before it could happen to me." "I don't know how to do this without mistakes either," Darius said. "I'm figuring it out the same as you are." She looked at him, at the yard between them, at the folding tables set up down the block for a party that might not happen after all. She didn't finish packing. She didn't say anything either. And Darius had learned enough about Evelyn Hart by then to understand that with her sometimes silence was not the absence of an answer. Sometimes it was the first word of one. The party started anyway. That had been Darius's call, made quietly at 7:45 in the morning, when he looked at the tables already set up and the food people had been cooking since the night before, and decided that Nolan Voss did not get to cancel something Cedar Row had built with its own hands. He didn't make an announcement about it. He just started setting up the grill, and one by one people came out to join him. By noon, the block was fully moving. Music from Marcus Webb's speakers, Ruth's potato salad in the bowl that was practically a neighborhood landmark the size of a small bathtub, always gone within the first hour, never successfully replicated by anyone who'd tried to get the recipe. The smell of ribs off a grill 3 houses down layering into everything. But the injunction was in Calvin's back pocket, and the people who knew about it were walking around it like furniture in a dark room. The city inspectors arrived at 1:15. 2 of them carrying clipboards and wearing the expressions of people who had been dispatched somewhere they hadn't chosen. They stood at the edge of the block party and waited to be approached. Calvin went over to meet them. He had a plan. It did not survive contact. "The permits we filed them 3 weeks ago. I have the confirmation somewhere on my phone. The charter's been active since '87, so the section that was cited doesn't actually apply because this isn't a commercial event. It's a nonprofit fundraiser, so the classification is different from what the filing claims, which means..." One inspector held up a hand. "Sir, do you have the permit documentation?" "Yes, definitely, somewhere." He started going through his phone with the focused anxiety of a man who had never once maintained an organized digital folder and was discovering that this was the moment that cost him. Across the lawn, Darius stood still and watched and said nothing. Some things you had to let land where they were going to land. Nolan arrived at 1:22. No company. No noise. He walked to the edge of the event with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving across the scene with the composed attention of a man watching something he fully expects to fail. He scanned the crowd slowly. He was looking for Evelyn. When he didn't find her, something small settled into his expression, a quiet, private satisfaction, like her absence was a small bet he'd already won. "Gentlemen," he addressed the inspectors as though he'd arranged the meeting himself. "Thank you for coming out." He produced his card with the practiced ease of a man who considered it a natural opening gesture in any conversation. "I'm happy to walk you through the specific violations if that helps move this along efficiently." Calvin had gone visibly pale. The permits were somewhere in his phone, he was certain of that, but the folder names he'd used defied any rational system, and Nolan was speaking to the inspectors with the smooth confidence of someone who already knew the ending, and the music was still going, because Marcus hadn't gotten the signal to cut it, and people were starting to drift toward the edge of the gathering to watch. "I've got it." Evelyn came through the side gate. She had a navy blue folder under her arm, tabbed, labeled organized in physical paper, the kind of preparation people do when they understand that documents matter more than presents. She hadn't changed what she was wearing. She hadn't written out talking points. She had just brought the work because that was what the situation required. She crossed to the inspectors without looking at Nolan, set the folder on the nearest folding table, and opened it. "Evelyn Hart, former City Attorney's Office, Municipal Land Use Division." First tab. "The permit for this event was filed 22 days ago under the Cedar Row Community Association's annual event charter reference number 47-19. The charter has been continuously active since 1987. The community center's non-profit civic space classification is on file with the city and has not been altered." Second tab. "The injunction filed this morning cites Section 12C of the Municipal Assembly Code. Section 12C applies specifically to commercial assembly events. This is a non-profit community fundraiser. The citation does not apply on its face." Third tab. "The inspection request filed against the woodworking shop at this address was logged without the standard intake report that municipal code requires before an inspection can be validly scheduled. The inspection as currently arranged is procedurally improper and should not have been escalated without that documentation." She closed the folder. The two inspectors looked at each other. One of them said, "We actually received a written inquiry yesterday about the intake process on that shop filing. It flagged the same procedural gap. That's part of why we pulled the full file before coming out here today." Calvin, standing a few feet away, looked briefly at the ground. He had sent that inquiry 2 nights ago, sitting at his kitchen table, not knowing whether it would matter or simply disappear into a system that was very good at absorbing things without consequence. It had mattered. Nolan stepped forward then. His voice was easy, unhurried, the voice of a man who had talked his way out of harder positions than this one. "Evelyn, you're not currently licensed to practice law in this jurisdiction." "I'm not practicing," she said. "I'm reading documents to city employees. That's not a bar function." "You always made everything more complicated than it needed to be." She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd walked through the gate. Not with anger, not with fear, with something harder to argue against the plain, settled exhaustion of someone who has heard the same line from the same person for too many years and has finally run out of any reason to respond to it as though it carried weight. "All further contact goes through my attorney," she said. "You have his information." "Evelyn." You heard her, Darius's voice, not raised. He had moved to stand beside her, not in front of her, not positioned between her and Nolan as though she needed shielding. Just next to her, present, settled, not going anywhere. Nolan looked at him, looked at Evelyn, looked at the inspectors who had returned their attention to the documents in the folder. He straightened his jacket, made no further argument, and left the exit of a man who understood precisely when a room had stopped reorganizing itself around his arrival, and who chose to withdraw before the recognition of that fact became something he'd have to absorb out loud. The inspectors confirmed the permit was valid. The community center classification was correct. The event could continue without interruption. The shop inspection was flagged for procedural review and would need to follow the standard intake process before it could be rescheduled. One of them thanked Evelyn for the documentation. She nodded once. Marcus cut the music. Then Calvin turned it back on louder than before. Calvin found Evelyn near the food table 20 minutes later. He stopped a few feet away. He had spent 2 days constructing something to say, building it out, refining it, finding the right framing, and everything he'd built had come out sounding more like a man explaining himself than a man apologizing. Those were not the same thing. He'd finally recognized that. So he set all of it aside. "I made you the punchline before I knew the first thing about you," he said. He looked at her directly. "There's no good version of why I did that." Evelyn studied him. "You didn't mean any harm." "Yeah," Calvin said slowly. "That's exactly what bothers me. I didn't think about it at all." He paused. "That's not better than meaning harm. It's just a different kind of careless." Something in Evelyn's expression shifted. Not all the way to warmth, but moving in that direction for the first time. "No," she said. "It's not better, but it's honest." She glanced at him. "And the inspector mentioned the written inquiry." Calvin looked briefly at the grass. "Didn't know if it would amount to anything." "It did." He nodded, stood there another beat. Then, "For what it's worth, you were something else out there today." "I know," Evelyn said and picked up her fork. Calvin laughed, surprised, genuine, nothing nervous in it at all, and walked away. An hour into the party, Darius walked past the setup table where the $50 bill had been sitting unclaimed since the afternoon all of this began. He stopped, looked at it for a moment, picked it up, folded it once, and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he went to find Evelyn. She was in a real conversation with a woman from the far end of the block, face open, gesturing with her fork, not performing ease, but actually inside it. Darius waited at a distance until it reached a natural pause. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "Hey." He put the 50 on the table between them. Flat, deliberate, no ceremony. She looked at the bill, then at him. "Nobody talked you into coming today," he said. "Nobody ran a long game or said exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. You decided." He said it at a volume the nearby people could hear. Not a speech, not a performance, just the truth, said clearly enough to reach the people who needed to hear it. "I wanted that on record." Ruth heard it from where she was sitting. Marcus heard it and raised his cup. Calvin by the grill heard it and stayed quiet for once in his life. Evelyn looked at the bill on the table. She picked it up, folded it exactly the way she had the first time, same crease, same deliberate motion, and pressed it into his shirt pocket. "Don't make it sentimental," she said. But the thing behind her eyes was not armor, not anymore. "Too late," Darius said. She pressed her lips together against a smile that arrived anyway, unguarded, unhurried, not waiting for permission, and it turned out to be the kind of thing that made the whole afternoon reorganize itself quietly around it. Ruth Malone went home at 5 with the empty potato salad bowl and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had learned when to speak and when simply to remain present and pay attention. She had done both in the right places this time, more or less. The Community Center Fund hit its goal before sunset. People give more generously when they feel like they've won something together, when the thing they're protecting feels real and specific and worth the effort. Calvin broke down the last of the folding tables at 7 and stood there for a while thinking about the $50, about the written inquiry he'd sent into the dark, about the day and a half he'd spent knowing something and staying quiet about it. He wasn't done thinking about any of it. That felt right. Some things deserved to stay uncomfortable for a while. Evelyn stood in the middle of Cedar Row as the string lights between the fence posts began to matter more than the remaining daylight, and she noticed something she hadn't anticipated. The particular tightness that had been her constant companion for over a year. The low-level vigilance, the inventory of exits, the readiness to pack and go before something could go wrong was quiet. Not gone, but quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Darius came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Someone had restarted the music at a lower volume, and two people near the center of the block were dancing badly and not caring at all about the fact. "You didn't have to come back out today," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." What changed? She thought about it the way she thought about most things, looking for the accurate answer rather than the comfortable one. "You said this was my home," she said. "Not that it could be someday. That it was." She looked at him. "Nobody has said that to me in a long time without attaching something to it. There's nothing attached to it." "I know." She looked back at the block, the lights, the people, the sound of it still going strong. That's why it worked. The music shifted to something slower. Evelyn did not move to leave. And on Cedar Row, on a late summer evening with the string lights coming on and the last of the food disappearing and enough money in a jar to keep a 40-year-old building standing for another season, that was how it ended. Not with a declaration or a dramatic turn, but with a woman choosing to stay in a place she had almost left standing next to a man who had never once tried to make her into something she wasn't. Which was, it turned out, the whole thing. The whole thing entirely. Darius didn't win anything that day. He didn't convince Evelyn. He didn't rescue her. He just kept showing up without conditions, without an agenda, without needing her to be different from who she already was, until she had enough evidence to trust what she was seeing. And Evelyn didn't open up because someone clever enough found the right angle. She opened up because for the first time in a long time, nobody was trying to. That's the thing about people who've been hurt in ways that don't show. They're not cold. They're careful. There is a difference, and the people worth knowing always figure that out eventually. Quiet kindness consistently given without asking what it earns that heals more than most grand gestures ever will. Darius knew that. Now maybe we all do. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Stories like this one keep coming, and you don't want to miss them.